Today we're going to continue our series on John W. Taylor and the history that surrounded his life. On today's episode, we cover a truly fascinating period in Mormon history. Now, we left off last time right as the LDS Church was about to sign the Manifesto. Well, today we're going to cover that, and also how the LDS Church continued to perform plural marriages. We cover how the LDS Church tried to keep this practice hidden, the colonies in Mexico and Canada, and how the LDS Church compartmentalized information so that the practice could continue. Now, if you ever wondered how the LDS Church was involved in Post-Manifesto Plural Marriage, stick around and get ready to have all your preconceived notions shattered. And that's next on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. Look, it's no secret that our society has become much more crude and coarse. To become and raise men and women of virtue and character is a Herculean task. To help with this, I have recently wrote and published a book. Now, back in the 1700s, Washington had a book called Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation. It was a book with 110 rules that talked about how to conduct yourself like a civilized person in society, something that today's society is sorely lacking. What I did is I went back through the book and I reinterpreted his original sayings for the 21st century. So the book is laid out in a way in which you see Washington's original rule. Right below that is my explanation for the 21st century, and below that you'll find 2 or 3 examples of where to use this in the real world. Now, to go along with this, there's a workbook that helps parents teach these principles and practices to their kids. To find the book, go to MormonRenegade.com, go to the bottom of the page, search out the blog post, and order your copy today. I can bear personal testimony from personal experience that this is an invaluable tool to help you raise men and women of virtue and character. Michael, back for round 2.
Round 2, round 3. We'll see how many we get down.
You know what? I was thinking about this last night. These are, I think, so important because I think fundamentalism stands at a funny place where if we're not careful, we could start losing some of our own history just due to time and distance. And so I feel like these are super important because this gives us a frame of reference, right? We certainly share history with the LDS Church on a lot of things, right? We share it on, like the Willie Martin Handcart Company. But really, fundamentalism has its own unique history once that split starts. And I feel like we really need to make sure that we're preserving some of that. So I really do feel like this is invaluable and important stuff, and I'm thankful for you and for the time you take in putting this together.
Thank you. I certainly appreciate that. And I think any group of people is pretty much in constant danger of losing their history if they're not careful. And we can see parallels in our more ancient history, with our ancestors and looking at the Book of Mormon. Lehi and his colony leaving Jerusalem, and they were told, go back and get your history.
Right.
And it turned out to be their family history, not just the Old Testament, as was currently written up to that point. And it had prophets like Zenos, and others who were probably either Manasseh or Ephraim from those tribes instead of from Judah. And they weren't Levites or what have you. And the Jews didn't preserve the words of those prophets that were in this family line of Lehi somewhere, or someone in their family took down the words of those prophets. Right. And it would have been absolutely lost if the Lord hadn't told them to go back and get that family history, which is we can see what could happen to us if we were negligent in looking at our own history and keeping it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, good stuff. So we left off last time right after the manifesto has been published. We were kind of getting some of the feelings of some of those brethren that were in the 12 about what this meant. And really the overarching idea was, once this manifesto was published, it seems like everybody was on the same page of music here, that we're just going to let stuff blow over. We're going to continue to practice this. And then as soon as the federal government's off our back, we'll go ahead and we'll start this again outright for everybody.
Pretty much. I'd like to recap a little bit, but before we do that, yeah, I would say my observation from that time period, right around the time of the manifesto, is it seems very heavily that Wilford Woodruff is definitely the most stressed out of anyone, understandably so. George Q. Cannon comes out being very political, but as far as the way he words things, but he is definitely not in favor of the manifesto.
Right.
And he's only supporting it and carrying it through because President Woodruff wants to shove it through, essentially, and make that concession. And yeah, let's just go back to some of the context really quick, the Cliff Notes. So around February of 1887, George Q. Cannon writes in his journal that public clamor demands and will not be satisfied with anything less than a complete cessation of plural marriages and a renunciation of that practice by us. We are told that public opinion is crystallized in regard to Mormonism. If it is plain to be seen from every expression made upon this subject that nothing less than the complete destruction of our system of plural marriages will appease the popular demand. We have decided that we cannot do anything more than we have done towards conciliating public opinion upon this question, and whatever may be the results to us and to the people, we must trust to the Lord to sustain and deliver us. So that was the way he felt about it. Shortly after that, you had the Edmunds-Tucker Act, which amended and increased the penalties of the Edmunds-Tucker bill. In November of 1887, we see Joseph F. Smith goes to live with John Woolley for a while. And in December of 1888, we see a government sanctioned or written document makes its way to church offices, and Wilford Woodruff calls a meeting of the members of the Quorum of the 12. Now, there was no first presidency at this point because John Taylor had died and they had not reconvened the first presidency. And 9 of the 12 were present, including Wilford Woodruff. And he presents this government sent document, and it is unanimously rejected by every single one of the members of the quorum. And Wilford Woodruff says, had we yielded to that document, every man of us would have been under condemnation before God. The Lord will never give a revelation to abandon plural marriage.
It's so crazy that they go from the Lord will never give a revelation banning plural marriage to just a few months later, essentially, that, hey, here comes the manifesto.
Yeah, so that was December of 1888. So yeah, you're dealing with almost 2 years, almost a full 2 years till September of 1890. And the pressure gets crazy. It just gets hotter and hotter and hotter. But in addition to that meeting where it was unanimously rejected by those present, there was another meeting held, and I want to find where that is. Let's see if I can find that. October 2nd, 1889, there's another meeting of the 12, and they were discussing the recent arrest of Hans Jesperson. Around that time period we talked about, right? Hans Jesperson and Matthias Cowley both had taken plural wives, and it got out that they were doing that because the previous policy had been, over the last few years, even before the manifesto was given, that if we don't want to be caught or legally with anything going on right now, if you are going to enter into the principle, you're going to do it in Mexico and you're going to stay there, right?
Right.
And so they're discussing this policy in a meeting. And Wilford Woodruff on October 2nd, 1889, is essentially saying, really, we need to only be doing this in Canada or Mexico. We just got caught with Hans Jesperson. And John W. Taylor says in that meeting, this is something I never expected to hear discussed in this light. I have understood it was policy for the brethren to take wives outside the United States. You could not publish that you would not give your consent that plural marriages should be consummated and at the same time have the marriages consummated in Canada or Mexico. I think it would be best policy to let the matter rest without saying anything about it, because if plural marriages are solemnized, it will soon be known and we will be considered insincere. I feel to have faith in the Lord and that he will bring something about for our deliverance. If we published anything on this matter, it will be impossible for us or the elders to fully explain to the saints, and much confusion will ensue. So he brings that up because Lorenzo Snow wanted to make a public announcement that, don't worry, we're not doing this in America, we're just doing it in Mexico or Canada, right? And it's like, no, let's say nothing whatsoever about this, because either we're just not going to be able to explain anything that will our motivations behind this, right? In any case, the reason I bring that up again, this meeting, was also because I neglected to mention that this is the very first meeting John W. Taylor presents the 1886 revelation to the Quorum of the 12, according to research that D. Michael Quinn did on a book that he was writing about John Woolley. So that's October 2nd, 1889. And then the next time you have John W. Taylor mentioning the 1886 revelation is right after Wilford Woodruff announces to the 12 that they're going to issue a manifesto. And in that meeting in particular, John Taylor didn't just bring up the 1886 revelation, he also brought up Wilford Woodruff's 1889 revelation, which he had after, this October 2nd, 1889 meeting. And they were promised that the Lord would take care of them if the priesthood did not make any further concessions to their enemies, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I find it interesting that John W. Taylor's idea is just don't say anything, right? Don't come out and say we're doing it, and don't say that we're not doing it. Just don't say anything at all.
Yep.
Silence is golden in this. Now, okay, the natural man in me, when you start talking about ceilings down in Mexico, plural ceilings, I would have been the guy that would have been like, so why don't we just buy Baja, right? Let's just go out someplace nice to the coast. We get to keep our wives, and also we don't have to deal with winter anymore. I see that as a win-win.
So John Taylor, right, as we discussed last episode, bought about 100,000 acres in Chihuahua, Mexico. In the book Kingdom or Nothing by Samuel Woolley Taylor, when writing about that point in John Taylor's life, when he was in hiding, he says that there was also another deal on the table that was further south, I believe, towards the coast, the Baja Gulf, not Baja per se, not the peninsula, but towards the other side of the Gulf, where there was 1 million acres for sale. So 10 times the land, right?
Should have took that. Should have took that. I just signed up for that in a heartbeat.
I would have too. One of the issues was that was kind of where some of the Mexican Indian reservations were, I guess, or
okay.
whatever the equivalent was, and there was some concern that pouring white settlers onto Indian land down there would have been cause for concern to everyone. And I don't know if that was a right or wrong move. I'm just throwing that out there because it's interesting.
No, that could have been. I'm just saying it sounds a lot more fun to be celebrating, Christmas in Baja with your entire family than and part of that could be it's like snowing right now. And
sure. It's here too. Yeah.
I might be looking outside going, we may have screwed the pooch on this one, Michael. We should have took Baja.
Yeah, a part of me agrees, although I kind of I mean, I like the mountains, but Mexico's got mountains, so I could probably live somewhere warm if, as long as it had mountains. But I don't know what a million acres looks like as far as like for context. If I were to see that like overlapped on a map, like how does that relate to the size of the state of Texas? I don't know how big that is, but Samuel Woolley Taylor insinuated at that point a million acres would have easily held every single member of the church at that point.
I'm fighting off feelings of getting gypped right at the moment. Um,
I'm sorry, dude.
no, no, I, no, it's just an interesting thought, right? Like, boy, it probably wasn't a stretch to think that they were probably thinking about it a little bit, right? At least send every
Oh, they were.
down there.
Well, another one of the guys that brought the deal, I think, was it Samuel Brennan or the guy that led the that ship voyage to San Francisco
No, I
early
can't
on
remember
with
his name. I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
yeah during the gold rush and the Mormon battalion
Yep.
era, and he left the church and he found John Taylor by letter, or whatever, and he was living down in Mexico and he offered that deal to John Taylor, and so that John Taylor also might have felt maybe this is too good to be true to in order to pursue it. In any case, that's what I remember from the deal.
Gotcha.
All right, so right before the manifesto, we have the test of the constitutionality of the Edmunds-Tucker Act was challenged, and in May of 1890, the Supreme Court ruled that it was constitutional, which officially disenfranchised and disincorporated the LDS Church. And then August 30th, the brethren receive a notice that there will be an attempt to seize the St. George, Logan, and Manti temples in August 30th, 1890. So we see the context. It's written on the walls what happens here.
Yeah.
Right? This thing was not created in a vacuum. It did not just suddenly happen. So I contest the narrative that God just revealed to Wilford Woodruff that you need to do this.
Right.
And as we discussed earlier, I think it's really a free agency thing. Like I've told you my will, my word concerning this thing. Nevertheless, it is given unto you, and I can't stop you. I can show you what will happen if you do and you don't. But that's what the Lord. I think that was the deal that the Lord gave to Wilford Woodruff, and Wilford Woodruff made a choice. And we see the reaction in some of the 12, as you were saying. For the most part, it's pretty unanimous that they didn't consider this to be a revelation afterwards. Mariner Merrill wrote that it was deemed more important to keep the temples and the work for the dead alive than plural marriage for the present. That's a direct quote. And Heber J. Grant, in fact, even said, I feel that this is merely a public announcement to the course which we already decided in our private councils, and yet I believe that greater troubles will arise because of our course in announcing this policy. And then in a meeting in August 20th, 1891, Mariner Merrill says point blank in his journal, I don't believe the manifesto is a revelation from God. And we start to see not a quick turnaround. There's pretty much silence right after the manifesto, besides the fact that the Supreme Court and others in the territory government basically started asking members of the church, do you really intend to stick by this?
Yeah. Yeah. Let me ask you this question real quick. Did Wilford Woodruff believe it was a revelation?
That's a tricky one for me to answer because by a year later, he's saying that the Lord revealed to me to do this. And I have a hard time with that because I know the Lord revealed to him in 1889 not to do this.
Right.
And so and I like what John W. Taylor said when he was first told of the manifesto. My first thought was to say, damn it, how is God, is God like a child that he can change his mind? You know, and he didn't believe that. It was a rhetorical question. And so I'm led to think the same thing. I know that God couldn't change his mind after giving the 1886 and 1889 revelation. So what is the true situation? If God's not changing his mind, it has to be something similar to Joseph Smith being led to ask the Lord 3 times about giving the Lehi manuscript to Martin Harris and his wife, right?
Right.
And
And
there's been other examples of this principle
you know,
throughout.
and here's the thing. We see this repeating today, right? Let's go back to the 2015 announcement that the LDS Church wasn't going to allow children of gay couples to be baptized.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the church got a lot of heat for that. I tended to kind of agree with the church, right? That, hey, we don't want to be causing divisions inside of, even though we don't recognize them as legitimate families, right?
Right.
Dads and the kids. We don't want to be making a kid disavow his parents until that kid's 18 and can make that decision. But Russell M. Nelson came out and said, well, that was a revelation from God. And then a few short years later, reverses it, right? So these patterns don't just go away, Michael. They continue to crop up time and again when it suits the leadership's political leanings, I guess. And those are, or public outcry or public opinion. So yeah, I find that fascinating that this is the first time we see that kind of capitulation, maybe assigning something as a revelation that may not be, that may be more of a policy, and then trying to reverse it.
Yeah, I definitely don't want to cast any blame on President Woodruff though for this. I think he was a very valiant man, and we're gonna see the evidence that he didn't believe the manifesto was a revelation abolishing plural marriage. He
Look,
would say that the Lord told me to issue the manifesto. That is a different thing than saying the Lord is taking away plural marriage.
well, that's a good point too. And I'm not trying to throw Wilford under the bus. What I am trying to show though
Mm-hmm.
is that there are consequences
Oh,
to
there are.
to capitulation. And one of those consequences seems to be that taking place in the mother church over and over and over.
Oh, sure. Or in the name changing or the rebranding that the church is going through, which I never thought I would see in my day. You know, it's to me, it's reminiscent of the 1980s with the reorganized church turning into the community of Christ, and so we've disavowed the name Mormon for,
Right, right.
and it's I can't understand. I mean, I understand the emphasis on Christ. Don't get me wrong, but I've never sought to receive validation from others regarding
No,
how my testimony is, my personal testimony is.
no.
You know, you can't be an effective missionary. You send out however many hundreds of thousands of young men and young women out there to preach the gospel in all nations in the world. And they're not going to do good if they're seeking validation for a label
Yeah,
instead of proclaiming that, no, this is my testimony. And I don't care if you call me a Mormon or, you know, sure, I am a Mormon, but my testimony is in Jesus Christ. And you don't need to go so far as to say that you guess what, Christians, you are right. We don't believe in the same Jesus because I believe that my Jesus Christ wasn't celibate and you know, or
right.
whatever you want to go to, you know, but and they're the ones that like to twist that, but it's funny because it's true because but I wouldn't want to believe in the the Christ of the creeds. You know what I
No,
mean?
no, no. I said for a long time before I ever left the church, you don't want to call us Christian, that's okay. Go down
No.
to the deep, deep South and see if you want that moniker.
Sure.
I'm fine being a Mormon. Um, I'm good with that.
Me too.
So, all right. So Wilford's went ahead. He's published this. What happens next?
We see in September of 1891, so a full year later, George Q. Cannon gives a letter to John Henry Smith. Now, do you remember who John Henry Smith is?
Oh, no. Refresh my memory.
So John Henry Smith is the son of George A. Smith, which was first
Okay.
cousins with Joseph and Hiram, son of John Smith, who was brothers to Joseph Smith Sr., right?
Right.
And John Henry Smith is also the father of future president of the church, George Albert Smith. Um, and um, he is very important in the next few years. And he is one of the brethren who was instrumental in getting Joseph Musser into the principal later, if
Okay.
you recall that.
Yep, I do recall that now.
So yeah, he gets a letter from George Q. Cannon, basically saying you have authority to perform sealings for any couples who, through poverty or any other impediment, are prevented from going to the temple.
Ooh. Through
Yeah,
poverty.
so uh, there's a lot of things that go on. Like there's a lot. Who else was it? Patriarch Alexander F. McDonald and George Teasdale down in Mexico. They also begin getting letters of recommends from George Q. Cannon, basically with similar language, like in a week or two, this brother is going to come down with his family. Give them all that you can, or take care of them to the best of your ability. Coded language or whatever, basically saying you are authorized to perform these ceremonies.
I want to go back to something though. You said I found that thing about um despite any of their challenges, whether they be too poor to go to the temple or something like that. What's he referring to there?
I was gonna say, well, so or other impediment. I was gonna say you're. It's too soon to be taking your plural life to be
Okay.
into the temple to
Okay.
have this dealt with. So therefore, we're giving you this authority to kind of oversee those matters
Gotcha.
in discretion.
I
What,
gotcha.
what were you thinking?
Well, that thing where it said poverty, I'm like, are they saying that if someone can't pay their tithing and they
Oh,
can't go
okay.
through the temple? I'm wondering what that poverty remark was.
That's just what it says. I can read the full thing if you want.
No, no, that's good. I was just curious.
In any case, so yeah, that happens. Wilford Woodruff is brought to testify in October 19th, 1891, to asking them, like I said, point blank, are you going to live up to your end of the bargain? And they ask him, quote, do you understand that the manifesto applies to the cohabitation of men and women in plural marriage where it already exists? And he answered, I could not see how it could be otherwise. Rough, right?
Yeah. And this is the part that's the most heartbreaking, right? It's one thing to discontinue the practice. It's another thing to be like, okay, now you got to pick a wife and just pick that one. And, that's what it's going to take to come into order, so to speak.
Well, he tells the rest of the quorum of the 12 that he said that under duress later.
Okay.
Abraham H. Cannon records in his journal that I attended my council meeting. The matter of the manifesto and the extent of its meaning was then discussed. So they're
Okay.
having this discussion, right? And President Woodruff said that he was placed in such a position on the witness stand that he could not answer other than he did. Yet any man who deserts and neglects his wives or children because of the manifesto should be handled for his fellowship.
Hoo-hoo.
So you're going to be excommunicated or disfellowshipped if you do not live with your wives and take care of your wives and children. But you're going to go to jail if you're caught doing it.
It really is kind of the same choice Eve was presented. Adam and
Sure.
Eve, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's very much pick one. It's not gonna, yeah, pick one. There's consequences to both.
Yep. So in July of 1892, we see George Q. Cannon write a letter to Apostle George Teasdale authorizing him to deal with the plural marriages in Mexico. And then we move into 1893. Now, according to the book Family Kingdom, written by Samuel Woolley Taylor, He says that in spring of 1893, um, Lauren Woolley told Nettie Janet Marie Woolley Taylor, now right, married to Apostle John W. Taylor, told her a strange tale of a secret revelation about the principal. Lauren said that right next door on the adjoining farm of John W. Woolley, President John Taylor was in hiding the night of September 26th, 1886, when he received a revelation concerning the principal and set men apart to continue it, regardless of what the church might do officially on the matter. Lauren said that he was one of the men set apart.
Okay. So from almost the get-go, there starts to be information leaked that, hey, there's ways around this.
So, yes, this is what would this be? 7 years later. Now, the source is secondhand late because this book was published in 1948. Okay, and it's the family reminiscence of John W. Taylor, and the Woolley family and all the interconnectedness of it. The funny thing is that Samuel Woolley Taylor is kind of a Jack Mormon. So
Right?
it's like, what skin do you have in the game to be throwing out, this
Right.
element into the book? That's kind of what I look at there, and because he was very nominal. He was never cut off from the church, but he was very nominal in his membership, and he moved out to California, and he got in a lot of trouble when he went to BYU as a young man, and he didn't really have a whole lot to do with the church, except for um, he would occasionally write a few books,
Gotcha.
history, and but I really like what he has to say, and I do believe that his mom, who was cousins to Lauren Woolley, was probably told that, and I have no reason to doubt why she would tell him that either. Um, Now, around this time, Janet Marie Woolley begins to go by the name Nettie. Janet
Right.
Nettie. Because it's you're underground now and you're hiding, so they call her basically for the rest of her life Nettie Mae Taylor, and so I will now refer to her in the narrative as Nettie
Okay.
Nettie Taylor. Right. Um, let's see. Right after this point in time, John W. Taylor took his second and his third wife, that's Nellie Todd, and Nettie Taylor, to Manti to do baptisms for the dead. And they baptized a president of Mexico by proxy in the Manti Temple. John W. Taylor apparently felt that would be instrumental in opening the doors to the
Hmm.
work amongst the Lamanites from having help from the other side,
Okay.
on the other side of the veil. So I thought that was interesting.
That's cool. Yeah.
That was cool. In 1893, you have the dedication of the Salt Lake Temple now, and so the government didn't seize the temples, and now we are reaping in the benefits from peace, right? And there's some interesting conversation that's alluded to in the book, but what ends up happening is John W. Taylor ends up taking all three of his wives to dedication, and
My
yeah,
man.
remembering that that's a little controversial because I mean probably no one even knew that he had two before the manifesto, let alone three.
Right.
Um, in any case, so he takes all three of them there, and I would like to say his system for plural marriage was that each wife have her own home. What do you think about that?
Look, I think those kinds of arrangements are going to be unique to each family, right? I can tell you
Absolutely.
from my standpoint, and Amber, my first wife, feels this way as well, is that if we can get everybody under one roof, at least for us, right? I'm not saying this is a hard and fast rule by any stretch. Everyone's got to figure this out on their own. But for us, it will only help to foster a cohesive family culture. Now, I know that that's not always possible. I know that that doesn't work for some people. And so I'm kind of like, you got to do what you got to do to make peace and harmony inside the family. And whatever that looks like, I tend to stay out of that. That's none of my business.
No, I just wanted to flesh that out a little bit. No, I think you're absolutely right. Brigham Young had most of his wives in one home, the Lion House, and but John Taylor had Taylor Row, which was a row of 9 houses on the same street. You know, which that's probably what if once the women in a plural family are probably going to like that idea the most. Oh,
Right.
same street, but our own house. That's neat. And
Right.
if you, good luck, I would say, in modern times of accomplishing such a thing. But I think you're absolutely right that circumstances change and are dependent upon the individuals. But at this point, you have all sorts of people, not just John W. Taylor. You got one wife in one state, one wife in another state, one wife in one country, one wife in another country.
Right.
And he's got one wife in Salt Lake. He's got one wife in Canada, and he's got Nettie living wherever she's living at this point. Now I'm not entirely sure. I don't remember, but all different places, and that's the way it starts. And that was kind of his. And I don't know if it's right or wrong to say this, but it's kind of like, I will provide this for you. You will have your own space. You can be the queen of your own world. And if you don't want to have anything to do with them, you don't have anything. You don't have to have anything to do with them. Is kind of the way that it was approached, right? And that's definitely not ideal to choose that. But I guess no matter what way you slice it, it's got to be true because you can't force anyone to do it.
No, 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 you can't. I will say this. I have a newfound respect for John W. Taylor taking all three wives to the dedication. I
Oh yeah.
the first okay, this is gonna make I know this is gonna make some people mad. But when I practiced plural marriage the first time, I took both of my wives through a session in the Salt Lake Temple. And yeah. Oh yeah, dude.
Dang.
No, I look back at those days and I'm like, I was like flirting with disaster all the time.
Dude.
Because that first time, I mean, I didn't have anywhere to go. I didn't know people, right? I was kind of out on my own. So I'm like, well, we'll just stay in the church and do this in the church. And yeah, dude, I would go to the temple with each wife. I mean, I was, yeah, no. Now looking back, I'm like, okay, well, maybe I wasn't so much up in the night. John W. pulled it off. I pulled it off for a little while
I
myself.
I think John W. had you beat. You took the name Mormon Renegade, but I really think that he was probably
He
the
was,
first one.
he's my man. There's no doubt.
Yeah,
I'm slowly developing and the dude had a kick-ass mustache. I mean, that stash
he
that
did.
he
He
rocked,
did.
that thing was epic. I mean, it made Magnum PI look like a prepubescent teen mustache.
Dude, some people can pull it off, and it's a hard thing to know when you can.
Absolutely.
I genuinely prefer I prefer wearing a full beard, but
Yeah, so do I. But he pulled it off. I mean, to his credit, he rocked
yeah,
that thing.
he
Um,
did. He was,
look,
according to his son, and probably through his son being told what mom said about it, is John W. wore the mustache because otherwise he felt he would look too young for leadership.
gotcha. Okay, all right. I guess I could kind of see that, but he really was the first renegade. I mean,
Yeah.
as I've done just a little bit of research, I'm like, oh, I feel a certain kinship with this man. This man is rocking it hard.
Oh yeah, he is. And so Nettie was also pregnant during during the dedication with our first child. And so that kind of adds a little bit to the to the conversation too. She's like, "Are you serious? You want me to show up with the other two looking like this?" Yeah.
Absolutely.
And
You
he did.
you get a sense just by the way he talks, right? As you read the few things that he has said, that this is not a bashful guy, right? He's going to be kind of in your face a little bit.
Mhm.
If you are someone who thinks that monogamy should be the standard within the Mormon world. He's going to challenge you on that. He's going to challenge you by the things he says, and he's going to challenge you by the things that he does. And I find that amazing.
Yep, he is, and the wives didn't always, they had their struggles too with it, and with him being so gung ho about it. By the way, and you can probably see this with at least most ladies, is you want comfort and stability, and when you got your husband rocking the boat like he is, it's like, stop,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, no, he's a stud. I mean, I hope I get to do podcasts from the other side because I really want to talk to John Taylor. John
Oh,
W.
oh,
Taylor.
me too.
I want to be like, all right, dude, pull up Billy up to this microphone. We got some things to talk about. So,
All right. So going forward, at least in the case of Nettie Woolley, right? She seems to have enough spiritual experiences to kind of lead her through the trials. And Samuel, in recalling his life and the life of his father, doesn't mention the other wives too much, and it's understandable. That's not the line he comes through. But in 1893, Nettie has a dream where she is shown the fourth wife that John will marry.
right.
And they do not meet her for another 8 years, but she has the dream 8 years before they meet
Okay.
that John W. will marry another wife. Okay, at least one, right? Um, Later that spring, their first child was born, and I believe they named him Joseph Bruce. Named him after the prophet Joseph Smith. And humor. So John W. Taylor was not able to be there for the birth, and he was planning to be, but because she was on the underground, they were moving her from somewhere in Utah to Wyoming, and they had bought a ranch, and it was her idea, and she just wanted to be out there in the country, and she just wanted to be away from the possibility of being caught and raise her family out there. And he was called to do some church business in Canada and was not able to make it. And she also she had the baby en route in the wagon to the property in Wyoming.
Wow.
And in any case, they get to the property, and he meets his son, for the first time, and he says that he's the spitting image of the prophet Joseph Smith.
That's awesome.
Which obviously shows you that John W. Taylor had some experience knowing what Joseph Smith looked like, although I don't know. I mean, how you can say a baby would look like that, but I can, but I also can see. In any case, that's kind of fun. Um, let's see. On the heels of all that, in February and March, the Temple Lock case comes around.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know about that?
Go ahead and fill me in.
Um, the Temple Lock case was controversy between essentially who was going to be recognized as the legal successor to the church that Joseph Smith started in New York, right? And so at this point, you have the reorganized church, you have the Temple Lock Church, and you have the church in Utah, and people are brought into court and to testify, and they you're telling the stories and you're laying your claims before the people and all that.
But hold on one second. The I don't want to say ownership of the church, but the legal church doesn't follow Brigham Young necessarily from New York to Utah.
No, it doesn't. Especially not after the government disincorporated.
Okay, that's a good point. I guess the government would have dissolved that, and then essentially a new church had to come up.
So the first church was incorporated as Church of Christ, And then Joseph Smith did reincorporate another church organization in Missouri called the Church of the Latter-day Saints. And then that evolved into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by revelation. That was what the Lord wanted him to call it after that point. Um, but like we said, the government kind of um, destroyed that one. And on the books, in this ruling, the federal government ruled that the reorganized church was the legal successor to Joseph Smith's
Really?
restoration. It did. It did.
Wow.
Yeah, so we got screwed over on that one. But whatever. In any case, I bring it up because Lorenzo Snow testified and made an observation regarding polygamy being against the rules of the church in the days of Joseph Smith when the doctrine was not yet revealed publicly.
Hmm.
He noted that those married polygamously before 1843, quote, would have violated the laws of the church and been guilty of adultery, and he immediately therefore conceded that Joseph Smith married Eliza R. Snow prior to the giving of the 1843 revelation, which is D&C 132, right? Um, and following up on the logical consequences of such a testimony, the attorney asked him what sort of position that put Joseph Smith Jr. and Eliza R. Snow in, and President Snow responded, it put them in a first-rate, splendid condition for time and eternity.
Nice.
And so
Nice.
you have that admission that yes, this was not against the rules of the church, but it was a revelation from God because it was not yet revealed. But it sets the framework for the idea that it can be underground
Right. Yeah.
because that's the way it was practiced by Joseph Smith. And when asked by the attorney, what position does it put Joseph in? And Lorenzo Snow's sister, Eliza, it puts him in a first-rate, splendid condition for time and
That's
eternity.
awesome.
I love it. Let's see. In June of 1894, on a trip to Mexico, Brigham Young Jr. and John Henry Smith go down. They go down there and they perform at least 5 plural marriages. And one of them was the stake high councilman, or a stake high councilman who went down there to get a wife, and he later wrote, "When I took my second wife, I had a letter signed by President Woodruff himself, and a personal letter from President George Q. Cannon
Wow.
authorizing that."
Okay.
And so up to that point, stuff's going down low key in Mexico. It's not super often, from what I can tell. Like I said, George Teasdale performed 15 marriages from 1893 to 95, and Brigham Young Jr. and John Henry Smith do 5 in May and June of 1894. The first instance of a plural marriage being done back in the state of Utah that I'm aware of is in July of 1894.
So a good 4 years after the manifesto.
Practically. And do you want to venture any guess who does it?
Is it my boy John W?
No, it's not. And unfortunately, I'll make note of this now. The interesting thing is, despite how vocal he was publicly and privately, he actually performed far less post-manifesto plural marriages than most of the others himself. He performed less ceremonies, but he highly encouraged others to
Was
go
it
and have.
was it Wilford?
It was not. It was Mariner Merrill, the same guy writing in his journal. I did not believe
Okay.
the manifesto is a revelation from God. He's acting as president of the Logan Temple, and he goes to Wilford Woodruff alone and talks with him, and got a recommend from George Q. Cannon on behalf of his daughter because he has a daughter who is interested in entering into another man's family, and so he seals his daughter in the Logan Temple as a plural wife on July 16th.
Okay.
Let's see. In 1895, February 15th, George Q. Cannon takes another wife. and this is an interesting situation because it's not, no sealing is done. And this is going to fly in the face of a lot of tradition. Um, and I guess I'm not here to argue whether it's right or wrong so much, but what they did was enter into a solemn covenant with each other without any other officiator.
Now the reason I fist pump right there is because that's how the first time around I did my plural family.
Sure.
And I've had people say, where is this scriptural? There's some stuff pointed to by Ogden Kraut, and as well, what's his name? The historian for the church for a while, Michael Quinn.
Yeah.
He points to it. Where can someone find that solemn covenant thing? What record is that?
Well, I was about to read the entry from George Q. Cannon's own journal, which I got a copy of excerpts of his journal and his son Abraham H. Cannon's journal that was published by Stephen Murphy, who
Okay,
was excommunicated from the AUB.
perfect.
And but also there is a book also called Solemn Covenant, um, by B. Harmon Carty, and there is a paper which was published in Dialogue by
Okay,
D. Michael Quinn that you're referring to, I think, which is called Plural Marriages between 1890 and 1904 with LDS Church Authority.
okay, perfect.
Basically, where he goes over a ton of the sanctioned plural marriages done, in this time period. And I have a copy of that, and it is where a lot of my research comes from.
Awesome. I just need to know where to point some listeners to, because I think they were politely telling me I was full of it.
Sure. So George Q. Cannon writes in his journal, um, had an interview with Sister Amelia Frost. We, George Q. Cannon and Amelia Frost, known as Amelia Frost Madsen, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and believers in the doctrine of marriage for eternity, being prevented by the laws of the land from carrying out our purpose while we are both alive, take this method of making known our wishes concerning the relations we desire established between us for eternity, so that in the event of the demise of one or both of us, our wishes may be carried out by our representatives or heirs. The said Amelia Frost has expressed the desire to be united to the said George Q. Cannon as his wife for eternity, and the said George Q. Cannon, being desirous that she should be sealed to him as a wife for eternity, mutually covenant and agree to be thus married for eternity by the authority of the holy priesthood through the sealing ordinance which the Lord has revealed. The object of this paper is to enjoin upon our representatives or heirs to take the necessary steps to have this marriage for eternity solemnized in one of the temples.
So where do you fall on that, Michael? Do you feel like that's a valid thing? I mean, what's your
I
thoughts
think
on it?
it's I think it certainly is if the situation was um well, I don't really foresee myself living in a situation where I wasn't going to live with her as my wife. And I was going to say, if you're not going to live with her and act as husband and wife, then sure, then absolutely this is going to be, yeah, maybe you're just making known to your posterity you want this done, easy peasy. But if the Lord told me that that was the way to do it, I have no issue with
Yeah.
taking her as an actual wife and living with her as a wife, raising children. I have now. I would like to say though, I'm very cautious when I do anything that's against standard protocol
Sure.
myself, or when I contemplate doing things that are normally against standard protocol. I would never like to abuse things that are revealed in a certain pattern. But I could understand that this could be done as a prelude to a more ideal circumstance.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I look, I was so careful, tried to be as careful as I could be when I entered the principle the first time. But even back in 2007, right? 2008, when I when I entered this thing, it wasn't like fundamentalists are today. I mean, there's been radical change in that short time period. Today, I would say if you want to find someone with proper authority to seal you, that's way easier. Now, if you're some convert that is living in, you know, Philadelphia, someplace like that, where there's not a lot of fundies hanging out, right?
Sure.
I could see where doing that would be wisdom until someone with proper priesthood authority can be located. I wouldn't say this is the ideal. I wouldn't say that this is something that you should just bank on forever necessarily. You should at least be in the mode of trying to find somebody to come seal you. But I feel like it's it's not out of the pale of orthodoxy to live it in that fashion until you can find that authority.
So, as someone who's been endowed, it's interesting because there's almost more prohibitions regarding what you can and can't do in relation to a common law type marriage or solemn covenant, because you covenant either in the church that you will not have sexual relations with any person who is not married, given to you by the holy priesthood or the church. Um, Depending on if you've been through a fundamentalist endowment or a church endowment, both are limited in scope. And according to Section 132, it also says um, interesting things regarding what conditions you place yourself under depending on the vows you make when you're married.
Right.
And so a man and a woman who are married and desire to enter, a man who's already married desires to take another wife, but he is not under a vow, it says, then he is justified. Meaning, if you're not breaking your vow to your first wife, you can take more.
Right. Yep.
And so that's completely correct in the sight of the Lord. But he says, if it is not entered into by these conditions, you have no promise in the life to come that it's eternal.
Right. Right. Yeah. It and it's interesting that the Lord brings that up in 132 because he's almost planning ahead for these days in some ways.
Yep, I think so. Let's see. Next down the list in the history, January 4th, 1896. Utah becomes the 45th state in the Union.
I'm not going to clap for that. Look, I'm a very patriotic guy. I kind of side with some of those territories who are like, we don't want to become a state. I get it. I get it. I'm not sure that was a great move necessarily.
Yeah, well, I definitely don't think it was a great move for the members of the church or the Mormon people in general, but uh, I thought I had it written here, the statistic I mentioned in the last episode, but after the state of Utah is admitted into the Union, the percentage of post-manifesto plural marriages skyrockets because we got what we wanted.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Um,
Interesting.
right after this, John W. Taylor brings Nettie back from Wyoming or wherever they're at to and he buys her a house in Farmington, Utah.
Okay.
You know where Farmington, Utah is?
Yep. Oh yeah. Yeah. Up there by Lagoon.
Yeah. Do you know what county that's in?
That, if I'm not mistaken, is Davis County.
It is Davis County. So remember that. And
Okay.
this is me foreshadowing something. Some
Okay.
people listening to this will already know what who's in Davis County, but
The
um,
Davis County Co-op.
well, no, I wasn't thinking about them. That they don't happen till a lot later. But um, the Woolley family, John W. Woolley,
Right.
lives in Davis County and is on the Davis Stake High Council, by the way, at this point. Um, let's see. I thought this was funny. Around this time period, I took a little excerpt from Family Kingdom again. Samuel Woolley Taylor notes that around this time, his grandfather or his father began chafing under the new policies of the church after the manifesto, and he didn't really mind what toes he stepped on. And when a new apostle was being ordained into the quorum, One by one, in order of seniority, the others of the 12 arose to laud the new member's virtues. And when it came to father's turn, he said, all new babies look alike to me. They're red and ugly, and they have to be tended, and they do a lot of bawling.
Wow.
Now, I don't know who exactly he was talking about at that point in time. It could have been Matthias Cowley, but I doubt it because they're good friends at this point. But on the other hand, I could also see it being a reference to Abraham Owen Woodruff, who enters the Quorum of the 12 at this point. And he looks remarkably baby-faced, and so I could see that being tongue-in-cheek humor
Right.
for young Owen Woodruff. But other apostles who get added at that point in time are Reed Smoot, Hiram Mack Smith, George Albert Smith, and Charles Penrose.
And how many of those new ones are distinctly in the no polygamy camp?
Um, Hiram M. Smith seemed to be kind of not necessarily against it, but definitely not for it. In the short time, he died pretty young. And got replaced. Charles Penrose was toe the line. We're not going to do this anymore after the Reed Smoot hearings, right? Like we're not quite there yet, where the 12 itself start turning against the principle, but people who do end up being in that position are now entering into the quorum of the 12. But on the other hand, Matthias Cowley, Anthony H. Lund, Mariner Merrill, Owen Woodruff, Rutger Clausen, and that's 5. John W. Taylor. Those are all 6 very strong pro-polygamy proponents that are still in the quorum, at the least at this point. Around this time, John W. Taylor makes remarks like Esau sold his birthright for a mess of pottage, and it will yet appear in the history of the saints that many have sold their inheritances for 30 pieces of silver, in referring to
Judas.
giving up the principle of plural marriage. In December of 1896, he is called to organize a mission in Colorado.
Okay.
And so the next few years, he acts as a mission president, and he takes one of his wives with him, which is Nettie, or Janet Woolley, to be mission president's wife in that mission, right? And let's see. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But I had to bring this up too. February 22nd, 1897, Miles P. Romney, which obviously has some relation to other prominent Romneys we know, marries his 5th wife, Emily Henrietta Eyring.
Any relation to? Well, it's got to have relation to.
Yeah. So you got a Romney marrying his 5th wife, an Eyring, sealed by Apostle Heber J. Grant in Colonia Juarez. Apostle John Henry Smith basically commissioning / compelling Heber J. Grant to perform that ceremony.
All right. Now, at this time, Heber's a polygamist, right?
Yeah, he is. He had 3 wives at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, and he wasn't against the principle for himself, and he later on in the Reed Smoot hearings was pretty defiant and said, darn it, I'm going to keep taking wives until I have a son, because I mean he had some sons, but they had actually died, or at least if he had, maybe it was just one, but in any case, by that point in the Reed Smoot hearings, he had no male heirs, and he told them defiantly, I'll pay my fine and I'll do my dues, but I'm not going to stop living polygamy until I have a son. And sad to say, he never did again. None of his wives were able to bear him any sons after that point. But I mean, if you hadn't been so opposed to polygamy, you could have probably, your odds would have been in his favor.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Okay. And that lady is not the only Eyring, by the way. We're going to mention some other Eyrings in the Eyring family that are involved with post-manifesto polygamy. Around April of 1897, when...
Can't get enough of the Mormon Renegade podcast? Well, good news. we're on Patreon, and there's 3 packages that you can choose from. The first one, the Slightly Rowdy package, allows you to hear the podcast without all those pesky commercials getting in the way. For those who want a slightly more in-depth experience, there's the Stirring It Up package, where you can hear ad-free audio, ad-free video, and transcripts. Finally, for those who want to go full renegade, that package is available too, where you can get everything in the previous 2 packages, plus an extra show where myself and Ben Winfield break down the news of the day from a very Mormon point of view. You will also get exclusive access to Renegade Chat, and on there you'll be able to talk to others about the show or whatever topics are on your mind. Go to Patreon today and get your exclusive content.
When away from church, the mission, John Taylor was as serving as mission president when he was sent away because he still had to do other things that apostles normally do, right?
Mm-hmm.
He wrote a letter. I found it was pretty sweet because now Nettie was expecting her 3rd child, and he writes a letter to her saying, "What in all the world could compare with the bright, intelligent sunbeam coming forth from one probation to another, clothed in embryo, with every attribute of its creator, being innocent from the beginning, coming to us as a gift for time and eternity, clothed with the elements of eternal and everlasting life, with power to grow and develop and go on, increasing and progressing from one stage of perfection to another, until it becomes even as our Father in heaven is perfect. Think of it, my dear beloved wife, that you have the honor of becoming the mother and I the father of one who has power, if directed right, to attain all intelligence, all power, all knowledge, and all glory, possessing thrones, principalities, and eternal life, who shall in the great future preside over its posterity, as our own heavenly Father presides over us. I say again, dear one, think of these things when the hour of pain and sorrow comes in bearing the fruit of your loins. Remember the reward and bear up under your temporary affliction, for sacrifice brings forth the blessings of heaven, and how we will rejoice when we can unite in beholding a new messenger from heaven, clothed with the intelligence of our Father and Mother in heaven, and all our own, not a gift to pass away with time, but one that is ours forever." That man is a smooth criminal.
Yeah, he is. I like this because this humanizes the principle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So often from the outside looking in, it seems very cold and academic sometimes in the way that it's portrayed.
Sure.
But here we get a glimpse into the feeling of the man's soul, right? What this principle really means to him and what it's really all about. It's about eternal posterity. It's about eternal families. It's not about self-aggrandizement in the vain sense of the word. This is about all those things that we as Mormons hold most dear and cherish most above all other things. This idea of an eternal posterity and eternal families.
It certainly is. That's and when you it all ties back to the plan of salvation, right? And you learn that as a Mormon, in pretty much any slice of the restoration that you follow, and it's the most beautiful thing in the world to understand that you have the promise of having an eternal family. And it answers the questions that sectarian Christianity with their philosophy was not able to answer. And there probably are branches of the restoration that I don't know what they do with that, because they reject even eternal marriages. And what a dismal thing to contemplate.
I mean, look, it's that doctrine that makes all the other stuff we deal with as Mormons, that's the reward, right? I mean, that's what it's about. That's why you do all these other things.
Mm-hmm.
From baptism to temple work. That's why we do all these other things, is to have those crowning blessings.
Yep. And so I thought that was neat for him to write a letter consoling his wife that he wouldn't be there again. And duty calls, and it's a hard thing because it is hard to put the Lord first when you've got your family on the line.
Yeah.
And the tender feelings of of your young lady or maybe not so tender expression of those feelings, because they can get pretty upset with you,
Right.
sometimes too. When you but you need to do those things, and you need to put the Lord first, and hope that they will also put the Lord first. And in any case, I'm sure it broke his heart though to do that. And let's see. Moving on from that point, by this point, there was a stake organized in Mexico, and so it goes from being a mission district presided over by an apostle to having Anthony W. Ivins being the stake president, and he kind of takes care of the majority of the sealings down there from that point, although Alexander McDonald still does. And on occasion, visiting apostles will also take care of certain things. Let's see. In fact, one of my notes here says Anthony W. Ivins married a couple, Walter W. Steed and his second wife, Susan Alice Bell Clark, which is sister of Nathan Clark. Do you know any of those names?
Nathan Clark.
Nathan Clark.
That sounds familiar, but I couldn't place him.
Okay, we're going to get more into Nathan Clark later. And Walter Steed, is one of the ancestors of a lot of Steeds that are in fundamentalism today. It's a big family name.
Yep.
In any case, he was married to Nathan Clark's sister. And he also lived in Davis County, by the way.
Going to the Steed name, it took me a few years to get the connection. But if you remember, right when I joined the church in 1995, there was a series of books that had just come out called The Work and the Glory.
Sure, yeah.
And no matter what anybody says, I still think those are great books.
They are.
And I owe a lot of me being able to recognize and kind of claim that history as my own a little bit through those books, right? Those really caught me up as far as church history. What I find interesting is that the name of the family that those books follow are Steeds, right? And
I've drawn that connection as well.
And I've often wondered from time to time, like, is there a part 2 to this? I mean, is there like another series of books where they start heading down south?
Do a fundamentalist history version of the same Steed family.
I have been so tempted at times.
Call up Gerald Lund. Was it Gerald Lund that wrote those books?
It was Gerald and Lund. Yep.
And so he's probably dead at this point. But I wonder what his connection, Gerald Lund's, was to Anthony H. Lund, who was involved in these very events.
Yeah, no, I've wondered that same thing. Because it's a funny name to pick out, right? You could have picked a ton of other historical names to go through this thing with, but he went out of his way to pick Steed.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're the only historical Steed family I know of, and I don't know when the Steed family this particular historical Steed family converted to the church. But in any case, we'll talk more about the Steeds in a few years at this point. So summer of 1897, John W. Taylor tells his wife that we're going to go fishing out in San Luis Valley. We're going to have a fun time. And, we never really got a honeymoon because if you recall, they were married by Francis M. Lyman at night in a carriage while they're driving around the park in Salt Lake.
Yep.
Very unorthodox. And then she got dropped off at home.
Yep.
And so he's basically making up like, okay, like let's go on a real honeymoon. We're going to go out into the mountains and we're going to go fishing and it'll just be us. And it doesn't really turn out that way. Coincidentally, there were other Mormon settlements in the San Luis Valley at this point, and they had grown pretty cold in the faith, you could say.
Okay.
And the basically some of the in the back of his mind intention was I want to go revive, the spirit in some of these people. And they go to a town called Manasseh, it's still there, by the way, Manassas, Colorado. And if you look on Google Maps and find that town, it is laid out just
Oh,
like a Utah town in the grid,
yep. Yeah,
you
awesome.
know. And they're staying there in Manassas, but they have a campsite out in the Conejos Canyon. And then all of a sudden, prominent leaders from the church start showing up, to where these meetings are. And he's starting to hold meetings. And in any case, you got all the Mormons from the towns in the San Luis Valley coming out to because the Brethren are there, John W. Taylor's there, and Gentiles end up flocking to the meetings in the canyon. And apparently it turned into quite a big deal, and hundreds of converts were baptized. And after an outpouring of the Spirit, John W. Taylor prophesied that a temple would be built in that town if the people were faithful.
Wow. And it hasn't happened yet, but
Hasn't happened yet, but I have an interesting historical anecdote regarding John W. Taylor and temples.
okay.
So we know from the last podcast that he also prophesied the spot of the Alberta Cardston Temple,
Yep.
and it was built on the very spot actually that he predicted it would be. When the church had another spot in mind for a long time, actually, but then it ended up being the other spot that he predicted. But there's at least another town, and I think he would probably do this. And I don't want to say he made a system of doing this, but I think I believe he was inspired of the Lord to do this too. But he made another promise in Safford, Arizona, one point where he was visiting there, and I don't remember what the year was. And he promised them if they are faithful, on condition of faithfulness, right, that you will have a temple in this town. I know of a man who came out with his family from the AUB, named Ted Jessup, who, when looking to do things that he was called to do, was looking towards Safford, Arizona, and the Gila River Valley area because he knew John W. Taylor had prophesied that a temple would be built in that area, and there was not yet a temple there. And he said in one of the meetings that he was holding, that the church was going to build one there, but Heber J. Grant made it so that the Mesa Temple was built first in order that John W. Taylor wouldn't be vindicated in prophesying that.
Interesting.
That's what Ted Jessup said in the 90s, but but if you go look on the church websites, there is a Gila River Valley Temple between Thatcher and Safford, Arizona, and it says on the website that John W. Taylor promised them that they would have a temple there. So, yeah. So at some point between the 90s and now, the church did build a temple there. But I would just say, if there's any people fleeing out into the wilderness that need to take the priesthood with them, think you have a claim, maybe you should look at Manassas, Colorado. I don't know.
Yeah.
To fulfill prophecy. I don't know. I just think there's something poetic to that. If you're, that kind of goes to, it's an interesting question of, the philosophical question of how much do we do to fulfill prophecy ourselves
Right.
versus just letting the Lord take care of it or whatever, or self-fulfilling prophecy or whatnot, what have you. In any case, that one's hanging over Manassas, Colorado, is all I'm saying. Let's see. Around this time, I might have been in Colorado in one of the branches. I took this snippet out of Family Kingdom. He says, "Get married. You men are only half men without wives, and don't be bashful about the girls. They're just as anxious to get married as you are. Look around you, men, at the girl sitting here. Pick out the one you like. Now watch her. If she smiles, she'll listen to a proposal. Well, look at that. Every girl in this place is smiling. And now I'll tell you, if she'll accept you. If she laughs now, she will."
Nice.
Well, brothers and sisters, it looks like we're going to have a flock of marriages. You can see,
You
like,
could see
what
why
kind of
people
charisma that.
Yeah, you could see why people were drawn to him, right?
Yeah.
This is a guy that's going to preach the gospel, but yet this is still a guy who's rooted in being human, right?
Yeah.
This is a guy who's not interested in becoming a marble statue. This is a guy who is very much trying to lead a people and do it in a very loving, good-natured, jovial way. And again, I love the humanity that comes through with these stories.
Oh, me too. And dude, that is psychologically so sly to, I mean,
Yeah,
to, to the point of where he's embarrassing both the young men and the young women, but he's getting them, but he does it in such a right way where I could see one, not giving the confidence to the young men to actually, okay, maybe I should go out and ask this young lady.
yeah,
You know, and it's, dude, it's the perfect icebreaker right
yeah.
there. Like this apostle in the church just broke the ice for every single person in that ward or whatever to go and talk about things like that.
Dude, that apostle was those young men's ultimate wingman, right? Like
Yeah,
beat
yeah.
that wingman, right?
No, you can't beat it.
Yeah, it's done, right? I mean, game over. You know who my wingman is? It's Sean W. Taylor. He just totally opened this bad boy up for me.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, and it's awesome the way that he takes that work so seriously, and it's no there's no outright mention of the principle there, but that very well could have been part of the reason, right?
right,
Why you know that he's trying to get people to enter into it. Um, let's see. In October 1897, in conference, he gives a talk about the law of Abraham, you know, which we know what that is by code language. And I never went back to find it to see if I could find it in any conference reports, but apparently he got kind of in trouble after that one because it was too on the nose, you know, for a public discourse. But in that same conference where he's talking about the law of Abraham, that's when Matthias F. Cowley and Abraham Owen Woodruff are ordained to the 12. Now, Matthias Cowley's got at least two wives at this point, and Owen Woodruff, who is son of President Wilford Woodruff, he's pretty young. I don't think he's quite 30 yet, probably 27, 28, but he's got one wife, no kids.
okay.
And I don't know how long he's been married, but they had a problem with fertility, and they were not able to have kids for a while. And we're gonna get back to that in a minute. Yeah. Um, right after conference, Apostle George Teasdale marries another wife. And yes, indeed, in January of 1898, so a good 3 or 4 months after young Owen Woodruff enters into the Quorum of the 12th, January of 1898, John W. Taylor prophesied that Helen Winters, wife of Apostle Abraham Owen Woodruff, would bear children, and in fact, her first child would be a son, and beyond that, that the son would be born with a cowlick.
Wow. It's pretty specific.
And he was right on all counts.
Wow. Holy cow.
And this would be nearly 2 years later that she had that son.
Holy cow.
So in late 1899. So yeah, so they had a while to let that promise marinate. And so he would have been 30 years old with it before Owen Woodruff had his first child. And there's other meetings where he would kind of, you know, Owen Woodruff would kind of talk to others of the Quorum of the 12 and say, you know, like I'm distraught. You know, we're not having any kids, no matter, you know, what we do. And I think Franklin D. Richards was one of them. If it wasn't him, it was Mariner Merrill. You know, reminded him, hey, look at the precedent we have and the faithful women that had struggled with childbearing in the scriptures and who
Mhm.
bore, you know, us. You know, essentially our entire lineage comes from
Right.
those mothers. In February of 1898, the family of a bishop named Lorne Harmer of Springville claimed that Joseph F. Smith encouraged him to enter into plural marriage in 1897. Um, while they were both in New York City on a trip, he says that in February of 1898, Joseph W. Summerhays, he's important later, talked some private business over with President Smith. I told him some of the brethren were getting wives, and I asked him if it would be all right if I took one. He said it would be under certain conditions.
Interesting. And see, Joseph F. Smith has an interesting history, right? Not only do we have this coming out now, but I know he was renowned for if somebody came up to him and said, "Hey, not in the 12 or something like that," and said, "I want to enter, the principal," he would say something to the effect of, "Well, if you can find someone to do it, God bless you." And
Yeah.
then he would walk away, and then I'll be darned if someone's not knocking on his door going, "I was directed to your home because you needed an ordinance done," sort of a thing. And so he was smooth as well with this whole thing.
He was, and I wish I would have footnoted it or recorded it. But I remember seeing in the days where he's president of the church, and he's not quite president of the church yet. He's in the first presidency at this point. But when he's president of the church, when he's out speaking in a branch in Idaho, he says point blank, "I will lie like hell to defend my brethren."
Yeah.
And and I think that's even an echoing or a repetition of statements that Joseph Smith made in his own
Yep.
life. And so when you take those things into consideration, the writing's on the wall, because he did make also a ton of public denials or uh, declarations that we are not doing this anymore, we are not practicing plural marriage. But like he said, I will lie like hell to protect my brethren.
Yep. Yep. No, this is such a fascinating time in Mormon history because it's a time of high intrigue. It's a time of like double agents, right? I mean,
Seriously.
there
Well,
is stuff
it
going
gets
on.
super compartmentalized.
Yeah,
There's like one group here and they don't know about the other guys being commissioned by the same person.
right.
you know it's like a spy movie, like you're
It
putting
really is.
down.
It really is. And yeah, it's a fascinating time that really sets up precedent for what becomes the modern Mormon fundamentalist experience. Um,
Yeah.
it's fascinating.
um let's see. So that was in February 1898 when Bishop Lauren Harmer and Joseph Summerhays, go and talk to President Smith. February and March of 1898, John W. Taylor and Apostle John Henry Smith go down to Mexico and Arizona. And while on that circuit from visiting the branches in Arizona and Mexico, they perform over 90 marriages, many of which were plural.
Right.
I, I don't have an exact figure of how many were plural, but I do know that this is when John W. Taylor begins to perform the first plural marriages post-manifesto that he performs. He performs one for his first one is February 22nd, George Washington's birthday, 1898, for Charles Whipple and Mary Walser. March 8th, 1898, for Anson B. Call, sealed to his third wife, Dora Pratt. And 3 days before that, he sealed Fred Heaton to Abigail Cox. And then there was three on the same day. In fact, now that I'm looking at this, so the first one was February 22nd. The second one was March 5th, and then he performed three plural ceremonies for three different men on the same day, March 8th, 1898.
Holy cow.
And then a sixth one on March 10th, 2 days after that. So one of those, so I found some interesting stuff here. Okay, so one of those was Anson B. Call, and I think he's the son of the Anson Call that lived in the days of Joseph Smith. But he, Brother Call, this was not the first plural wife that he had taken. He had taken a second wife in Mexico already when the like he went down to Mexico when the manifesto was first issued. We're 8 years removed from that now, right? But I don't know if they were able to have any children before. And in any case, she dies. His second wife does, and so he's getting permission to get to enter into the principal again. And John W. Taylor was able to do that for him. In any case, in his own family history, I found he has some interesting reminiscences about some visitations or experiences he had in Mexico that I felt was very interesting. In his own memoir, Anson B. Call writes, "Sometime during the night, a personage appeared at the foot of my bed. I raised up and sat up in bed and discovered that it was my father. He held a book under his arm. He took the book out and opened it and told me that it was an account of my life. It showed me the debits and credits of my life and appeared to me to be about one third full. I thought that the debit side exceeded the credit side and that my record was very bad, as the last entry made on the debit side was very large, the largest in the whole of the book. My father told me that the Lord was very displeased because I had not acknowledged his hand in taking Haiti, which was his second wife, I guess, and that the last large figure represented this. I attempted to add the debits in the book, but my father closed the book and said no one but the custodian of that book had any right to examine its contents. He said that the custodian of my book was John W. Taylor, who later married me to my third wife. He told me that my life was generally approved, but that the Lord was very much grieved at the last recording. However, he assured me that the credits were greater than the debits, even though they appeared to be less, as they recorded the debits more often than they did the credits. My father said that I would live to fill that book and that I would not be taken until it was filled. As it appeared to me to be one third full, I figured I would live to be 84 years old. Uh, that's what he wrote. Consequently, he ended up actually living to be 91 years old. But yeah, so he has this vision where he's struggling with the death of his second wife, and the Lord makes it known to him that it was ordained by him to take her back, and that there would be someone, that to fix this situation, or the the John W. Taylor will be sent to take care of that.
Okay.
Isn't that awesome?
That is awesome. Holy
And,
cow.
and this is before he married her, the third wife.
Wow.
So he's relating this to his posterity and his own family history.
Holy cow. Dude, those are the experiences that I feel like we're not taking advantage of in Mormonism. Um, I I think if we're living as best we can and we are really striving, we should expect those to see some of those things in the course of our lifetime. I think that's the promise of Mormonism.
I think so to a degree. I'll just say I've had enough experiences in my life that I don't demand them.
No,
Um, and
no,
I wouldn't say anyone should, but I do know what you mean because it's a fine line. I'm just very super cautious when it comes to that. But you're right though. When you look even at the Book of Mormon, it says miracle. If you say that miracles have ceased, it's because you have no faith.
right, right, absolutely. Um, I'm not saying go out and demand a sign like the wicked generation. I'm just saying we should be more open to it.
Yeah, and that's a good way of putting it. We should be more open to it. And I'll be honest with you, Dave. I struggle with that to a point because I am personally more analytical, bordering cynical
Right.
sometimes. And I don't know if that's just the way I am or if I've made myself that way just through my own
Well, and I'm not
experiences.
saying we should
But
believe every claim that comes along either, right? I think
sure.
we do have to be somewhat analytical, if not downright skeptical at times, but for personal experiences more than anything else, right?
Yes. And I
I'm
concur with
I,
that.
I'm always very cautious when I hear of a guy who's having visions every day, right?
Oh, me too.
At that point, I'm like, bro, are we okay? right? But and you can always tell, right? Like I remember I had a bishop who was in Vietnam, and he was in the Tet Offensive, right? And there was another guy in our ward who was always talking about his time in Nam, right? And I remember once he told me, this bishop told me, he said, you know what? He's like, I don't think he was at the places he said he was. And
Interesting.
I'm like, why is that? And he's like, anybody who was in the Tet Offensive, we don't talk about it. And sure enough, it came out later that the guy was like a clerk who never left, whatever. But
Sure.
he was right. And sometimes I look at spiritual experiences like that, right?
I
Like
do
the
too.
guys who are out there saying they have them all the time, I get a little skeptical about. The ones I tend to believe are the ones that are told to me in private in a very solemn environment. Those are the ones that tend to have the spirits, have the spirit testify of truth of these things. So I guess what I'm saying is that we should be in a position to where we shouldn't be surprised when those happens, not necessarily seeking for them, but understand it is definitely part of the gospel plan.
Absolutely. And I'll just say that the period of my life where I had experiences the most frequently was nearest when I was serving a mission for the church, where according to the light and knowledge I then had, the way that I was acting, and being in complete constant service on the Lord's mission, I was blessed highly of the Lord to receive personal revelation, um, of the Adam God doctrine, of the general beginnings of the my understandings that things are not right where they're at, and that where I need to be needs is going to be different, and pleading with the Lord myself that when I got off my mission, I would not lose the testimony I had, and that I would have the strength to do whatever it took to cling to the restoration, because I saw people going back to the world all the time, and I was very richly blessed with information and with a very strong testimony, that I can fall back on from those experiences, which came from my own personal sacrifice and consecration.
Right.
And that's just my testimony, I guess, as we're bringing up this, is if people want those things, it's going to be through sacrifice and consecration.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Um, so we get into the interesting phase with Matthias Cowley now. On April 13th, 1898, George Q. Cannon authorizes Matthias Cowley to perform a plural marriage sealing for Ben E. Rich. This is the first time that Matthias Cowley receives authority and a commission to perform plural marriages. He later tells the other apostles when he's brought to trial many years later, President Cannon told me personally to attend to these matters. There was no laying on of hands, but he gave the authority personally. The commission at this time was to marry Brother Rich, but I was later told by him that I could attend to suitable cases. Cowley performed the first of these marriages for Benny Rich, who was president of the Southern States Mission. And he later explained to the Quorum of the 12 that I was never instructed to go to any foreign lands to perform these marriages, although in some cases I did do so. President Cannon told me to do these things or I never would have done it. Most of them went to Brother Cannon and then came to me.
Okay.
And so from 1898, from 1904 to 1904, when the second manifesto was given, we have documented about 40 or 45 plural marriages that Matthias Cowley did alone,
Holy cow.
which basically is like 30% probably of all the ones that we're aware of that were done by members of the 12 that he single-handedly took on himself.
That man was busy. Holy moly.
You have no idea. I have copies of marriage records from that time period because they would keep these marriage records in books out of temple ceilings, books that later
Right.
would get turned into the church offices. And he was a busy dude. He was a busy, busy, busy guy. But I love what he said there is that President Cannon told me to attend to these matters, and that most of them would actually get a recommend from George Q. Cannon and then come to him. But that is all. That would only apply till the time that George Q. Cannon died in 1901, and then you have Joseph F. Smith kind of taken over the reins there, so to speak,
Gotcha.
afterwards. Um, September 13th, right after this. So that was April 13th is when Matthias Cowley performed that first ceremony. By September 13th, Wilford Woodruff had died and a new first presidency was organized. And Lorenzo Snow is now president of the church. And right after that, because of this commission that Matthias Cowley gets from George Q. Cannon, Matthias Cowley went to President Lorenzo Snow and asked him about whether or not the authority was legitimate. And President Lorenzo Snow told Matthias Cowley that he did not want to be known in or interfere with Cowley's commission from George Q. Cannon to perform new plural marriages. And so either he completely endorsed it or was willing to turn a blind eye in either case.
At any case, this is the first time we can see "don't ask, don't tell" being implemented.
Yeah, in a far better way, I would say, than that
Yeah,
term is generally used. But he said, I will not interfere with President Cannon's work.
interesting.
And George Q. Cannon also dies before Lorenzo Snow dies. And if I remember correctly, so when Wilford Woodruff dies, new presidencies or set apart. He goes to Lorenzo Snow, asks, "Is this legit still?" And then George Q. Cannon dies before Lorenzo Snow does, right? And then Matthias Cowley goes to Lorenzo Snow and says, "Is this still fine that I keep doing this?" And basically the same answer.
Wow. Wow. So it's a silent endorsement.
From Lorenzo Snow. Um he would make strong statements as well publicly that we're not doing this anymore. But according to Matthias Cowley in private, that was not the case. According to Joseph Musser, he received a letter from Lorenzo Snow
Right.
telling him you've been selected to enter into the principal. And we see instances where Lorenzo Snow takes measures to make sure that local authorities are not cutting off people who have been found and exposed to the lawful authorities that they've
Mhm.
taken new wives or entered into a polygamist situation. In fact, I think he told George Reynolds once in private that he admired the grit of any woman who was seeking to enter into the principal during these days.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Maybe not so silent.
But no evidence that he was involved with the performing of any of them. So
Gotcha.
yeah. So he was better doing his job in a way than Wilford Woodruff and Joseph F. Smith were because we have plenty of evidence from them.
Now, at this time, has the demographics of the Quorum of the 12 changed at all? Is it still kind of 6-4? And then,
No, the vast majority are for plural marriage still at this
okay.
point. In fact, you could even, if you give me a second, I can actually pull up who is who at this exact point in time. So we're dealing with 1898, and yeah, you have President Lorenzo Snow, George Q. Cannon, and Joseph F. Smith in the first presidency. That is a slam dunk for approval
Yep.
all the way around. You have Franklin D. Richards still alive as president of the Quorum of the 12, from Joseph Smith's day. Brigham Young Jr., Francis M. Lyman is third in seniority in the Quorum of the 12. And we've seen that up to this point, he is also in favor of plural marriages.
Right.
John Henry Smith, obviously carrying them out in Mexico. George Teasdale, carrying them out in Mexico. Heber J. Grant being told to carry them out in Mexico by John Henry Smith, um, John W. Taylor, Mariner Merrill, Anthony H. Lund, Matthias Cowley, Abraham Owen Woodruff. There is not a single member of the First Presidency or Quorum of the 12 that has not been involved or will not be involved in the future in post-manifesto plural marriages.
Interesting.
By
Okay.
this point in September of 1898.
All right. Are there any excommunications going down at this point?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Okay. So it very much is, we're going to keep this alive and we're just going to be really super quiet about it.
Yep. Yep. Um, in October of 1898, John W. Taylor becomes one of the first people, or one of the few instances, I shouldn't say first because I don't know when the first was. He becomes one of the very few instances publicly where he is not sustained unanimously in conference because he offended the I believe basically what the time period's equivalent of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir was. And in a conference talk, he basically insinuated publicly that there was some immorality going on there, and
Ooh.
he told them to repent. Uh, and they got really fired up and did not like him. And apparently, the way it was said or delivered wasn't maybe his best moment. And he said later that I kind of put my foot in my mouth on that one, and George Q. Cannon got up after him and kind of played some damage control. And, well, Brother Taylor's been very frank with us and so forth and so on, but maybe this shouldn't have been said in a public forum or something like that in any case. But there was some opposition to his sustaining vote in that conference.
I'm sorry to laugh. I just imagine John W. walking by President Cannon and President Cannon going, "Thanks, SOB. Now I got to fix this." Right? Like,
Yeah.
because the other thing you get, maybe not so much during this time period, but definitely later on, when things become really hard for people wanting to practice plural marriage, is that John W. Taylor essentially becomes a pain in the ass to all those trying to subvert plural marriage.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a guy you can paint in pastel colors, right? This guy's a firebrand. He's gonna let it fly come hell or high water, and you get the sense that he almost becomes a liability to the status quo later down the road.
He does, and I mean, the way that Samuel Woolley, his father-in-law, put it to his family is John W. Taylor was either born too early or too late.
Right.
If he was born during the days of Joseph Smith, he would have flourished, and maybe at some other future day there will be a time where he would have flourished. But he was basically destined to come into conflict with others of his peers. After conference, October 25th, Apostle George Teasdale, resident apostle down in Mexico, marries his fifth wife, and it is performed upon the high seas by Apostle Anthony H. Lund.
On the high seas?
On the high seas, on a ship. Yep.
Wow. Well, it's going to be hard to get busted out there.
It's going to be hard to get busted out there. You can technically tell the government that we were not married in the United States.
Yeah.
All of that, and which is why it was done. And this is the first record I have of Anthony H. Lund performing a plural marriage. But he was made aware of that being done earlier because Wilford Woodruff himself took a plural wife under the same circumstances a year earlier before he died.
It's really economical because you can go ahead and have your wedding at sea and then you go on a cruise for your honeymoon. I'm just saying there's some wisdom there.
Yep, there sure is. Right around that time, John W. Taylor and Nettie move back. He's released from his mission in Colorado, and so they go back to Farmington, Utah. Going into the next year, Matthias Cowley marries his third wife, Harriet Benyon. So another relation to modern church hierarchy, in the Benyon Eyring family. Um, when later asked many years down the road in his trial who performed that marriage to his, Cowley's marriage to his third wife, he said, quote, "Brother Merrill put me under solemn covenant binding me not to tell. I was married in the Logan Temple, so I leave you to guess the rest." Which is a very much not veiled, but jokingly veiled way of saying Mariner Merrill married me in the Logan Temple because he was temple president.
Right.
And he had been performing several. The first one, as we mentioned earlier, was in June of 1894, and he definitely had a record for sure, Brother Merrill, in performing polygamous sealings in the Logan Temple during his lifetime. I don't have an exact count, so don't ask, but there was a few of them.
He seems to be a stalwart, right? His name
Yeah,
gets tossed around quite a bit.
yeah, no, he's one of my favorites. I think in January of 1899, in a meeting of the 12, Apostle Franklin D. Richards promises Owen Woodruff that all of God's promises to him will come to pass, knowing that Owen Woodruff had just received a new patriarchal blessing, which stated that he would have plural wives, which he did not currently have.
Interesting.
April 25th, 1899, Heber J. Grant says, I think this is from his journal, talked much on polygamy and intimated that he would perform the ceremony in Mexico for any man who did not have any children, though he said that president would not consent to it. So what he was doing was he was talking to, this is so funny. He was visiting the mission field in California and talking to elders, because back then you didn't just send boys out to
Right.
go, teach the gospel. And he's talking to married men, presumably, who don't have children right now. And he's telling them, "I will go down and perform a sealing in Mexico for you if you don't tell your mission president."
That's awesome. Oh, and who was that again saying he'd do that? John W. Taylor?
No, that was Heber J. Grant.
Dude. See, Heber had so much promise, right? I mean,
he and George Teasdale were called by revelation at the same time to John Taylor.
yeah.
Yep.
Had so much potential, and then he screwed up the end game.
Yeah, kind of, sort of. The president of Ricks College, now known as BYU Idaho, at this time in May 1899, was sealed to his third wife by Apostle Matthias Cowley after conferring with Mariner W. Merrill about it. So he arranged the whole deal, Apostle Merrill. June 15th, 1899, local 70s president of Davis County, Jaron Tolman, and married his fourth wife. And it looks like I don't have an officiator written there. But remember the name Tolman, by the way. He's the son of a very important person later on. I was also going to mention, and I forgot to mention because I skipped over it, I guess. So it disrupts the narrative I wanted to have earlier, but I'll go back and talk. When in the mission field in Colorado, and when Nettie was having her baby, they sent her sister Phoebe Woolley out to go take care of her while she was pregnant. Phoebe Woolley, who was living and taking care of her sister, becomes very important also later in the same way almost that the Tolman name becomes important, which is what reminded me. Phoebe Woolley marries a returned missionary later who served in the same mission at the same time as Joseph Musser.
Interesting.
Yeah, we'll get to that. July 11th, 1899, Apostle Mariner Merrill tells the 12 at a quarterly meeting that the manifesto is not a revelation from God and that plural children will always be born in the church from year to year for all time to come.
Nice.
Yeah. October 7th, 1899, Mission President Lewis A. Kelch Sr. and second wife are married in Salt Lake by Matthias Cowley.
Okay.
Do you know who Lewis Kelch is?
Oh yeah, he becomes a major figure in fundamentalism down the road.
So you may be thinking of his son, Louis Alma Kelch Jr., who becomes a member of Lauren Woolley's Council of Friends.
Mm-hmm.
But this is his father. But he is very instrumental in the well, I don't know how instrumental, but very supportive of the underground polygamous movement.
Gotcha.
Very supportive.
So I have a question for you, and this is going to span this entire history here. Do we ever see any instances of anybody inside the church, any member of the 12 or anything like that, arranging marriages? Like, you should marry so and so.
That's a good question. I know in early history, if you call Nauvoo and early Utah, early history, I know I come from at least one of those marriages where Brigham Young arranged. I don't know how strongly it was arranged, but it was definitely different circumstances. Um, but it did at least happen, at least in that one instance, and it probably happened in others. But it was
Okay.
definitely, from what I've seen, doesn't seem to be a normal thing.
Right. I've encountered a few of them, but they seem to be more outliers than the norm. Is that kind
Right.
of where you're seeing as well?
Yeah, I don't see a ton of arranged marriages.
Okay.
Right after this, in 1899, John W. Taylor ordains a man named John Anthony Wolfe a patriarch. A few years down the road, he gets commissioned by Joseph F. Smith to perform plural marriages in Canada when John W. Taylor is pretty much not there.
Right.
Um, December 12th, 1899, Owen Woodruff performs the first plural marriage sealing that I'm aware of for Alvin David Nelson and his second wife down in Colonia, Oaxaca, in Juarez Stake of Zion. And so it's so interesting to me. We're going to really get into some. I have some of Owen Woodruff's journal accounts and entries, and I'll just preface. We're about to get into some of those, so I'll just preface it first. But he was brought in as a young man, 26, 27, 28, whatever he was, into a quorum of the 12. He's a monogamist, and he's literally in a quorum filled with polygamist or pro-polygamist people. And what else could you have expected? But he pretty much gets taken under the wing of John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley in particular.
Okay.
And as the tide starts changing, he is pretty loyal to them.
Okay.
The real tragedy is that he dies right after the second manifesto at a very young age. He was like 33 years old.
Wow.
Yeah,
Oof.
smallpox. Otherwise, the game could have been severely different. To have a protege of John W. Taylor and Matthias Cowley in the quorum of the 12 after they got cut off
Oh yeah.
would have been a big game changer.
Or they would have just X'd him too.
Yeah, and he could have gotten into that circumstance too, but he would have lived a lot longer than they did because he was,
Right.
he was half their age at this point. So yeah, he performs that ceremony in Mexico in December of 1899. Um, Rodney Badger is a guy that we're going to talk about later during the Reed Smoot hearings. I believe that he is down. No, he doesn't go down to Mexico. He gets married in Salt Lake City to his third wife by Matthias Cowley. I believe he ends up being Reed Smoot's attorney, and if it wasn't him, it was his brother or someone else. But I'm pretty sure that was Rodney Badger becomes Reed Smoot's attorney, or not attorney, clerk. In any case, Matthias Cowley also performs a sealing for him. Let's see. During during a quarterly meeting in January 1900, Mariner Merrill says speaking of the principle of plural marriage, said it had come to stay in one form or another. That's what he had to say to them. So this guy's hammering him. I don't know how he didn't get cut off, because obviously there's some sort of conversation going on, because this is the third or fourth time in the last few years we're seeing him bring that up in meeting. And there will be children to the end born in plural marriage to the end of days in the church, or this is coming and it's staying in one form or another.
Right. He's kind of giving them the business that we're not backing down off this.
Right. And he never did. He never did. He died about 1907 or so, and we'll get 7 years down the road. Right after that, Brigham Young Jr. tells. In fact, I think it's the same. 2 days later from that meeting, Brigham Young Jr. tells Owen Woodruff that the time that plural marriage will be restored, air quotes, and in that meeting, or after that meeting, or on the same day of that meeting, um, after hearing Brother Mariner Merrill say what he had to say, and hearing Apostle Brigham Young Jr. tell him what he said, he writes down in his journal, "I absolutely know that a number of the brethren, among them John W. Taylor, George Teasdale, and Matthias F. Cowley, entertained feelings in harmony with my own. I owe my existence to the principle of polygamy, and I have some intense feelings regarding the sustaining of that principle. I am indebted to that principle for my life, and any time my father wants my life to defend that principle and those who practice it in righteousness, God being my helper, it is at his command."
Wow. Wow. Laying it down hard.
So in that same meeting, that's when President Lorenzo Snow had said in that meeting, if basically any person who disobeys the law to polygamy or unlawful cohabitation, he must bear his own burden. And stuff like even telling him, you guys do not have my sanction to perform plural marriages at this point. And so that's what kind of gets the reaction out of Brother Merrill. That's what gets Brigham Young Jr. to make that promise to Owen Woodruff. And Owen Woodruff is confiding to his diary, that he knows that there are some men who are stalwarts in the quorum that feel the same way that he does at this point.
Right. Whew. What is your general feeling on Brigham Young Jr.? Is he all about this as well?
Yeah, I think the way he says that to Owen Woodruff, that polygamy will be restored, is interesting, and that's the narrative I always heard
Right.
in my. Um, but we've already seen from this episode that I think he's taken at least two wives, if not one for sure. I remember reading that to you. One, if not two wives himself, and he's performed other sealings down in Mexico, visiting with George Teasdale and what have you. And he was very much in favor of, and he's in the loop. And like I said earlier, these things have become relatively compartmentalized, where it's not like, the funny thing is, we have evidence at this time showing that every member of the quorum at that point was pretty much either endorsing, arranging, or performing Post-Manifesto Plural Marriages, but that they were not aware that every single one of the others was also doing that.
There's probably wisdom there, right? Because
There is.
if you don't know, you can't spill those beans.
And so Brigham Young Jr. probably said the way he did to Owen Woodruff, who's now the youngest member of the quorum, who, not knowing how much he knew regarding what was going on, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I'm surprised that like Brigham Young Jr. doesn't get excommunicated when John W. does as well.
He dies too soon.
Oh, okay. That's why.
Right
Gotcha.
after the turn of the century, like, we're about to see the and we'll get to that to the next episode, but we're going to see a huge drop off in the popular support right now. Like this is, we're entering into that territory in the time frame where George Buchanan's about to die. Abraham Cannon had died just before this, but I didn't make notation of that. But he was a member of the quorum who was supporting it. Lorenzo Snow is about to die. George Buchanan's about to die. Mariner Merrill dies in about 5, 6, 7 years. George Teasdale dies in about 5, 6, 7 years from this point. Owen Woodruff dies in 4 years from this point, at the young age of 33 or something. And instead of it being a stacked deck of cards in favor of polygamy,
Right.
you end up with a few guys like Joseph F. Smith, Anthony H. Lund, John W. Taylor, Matthias Cowley, and Rutger Clausen.
And they're the ones holding the line essentially at that point.
Pretty much at that point, yeah. But authority then begins to be dispersed to other individuals in other quorums, like high priest quorums or patriarchs at the stake level.
Right.
And it's more distributed at that point. And we'll get into that later. Do you have any other questions or commentary or rude remarks?
No, I'm keeping the rest of my rude remarks for later. So
I had a mission companion who always say that at the end of a lesson. Any questions, concerns, rude remarks?
That's right. Right. No, you got to spread those out. You can't use them all in one shot. So you got to have them equally distributed throughout this series here. All right. Well, dude, that was good stuff. Anything you want to go over for this episode more than what we covered?
I don't know. I think we can start back with another one, and we'll go into a more detailed account of those meetings being held at the turn of the 20th century from Owen Woodruff's journals.
Yeah. And go over that Tolman name.
Yeah, we're going to get into that very soon. And like I said, we've approached the end nearly of where the 12 are pretty much in harmony over the principle existing secretly, and we will begin to see contention and division as people are replaced or die and are replaced, and as the politics become more increasingly complex again.
Yeah, and I think this next episode will be where we get to see John W. Taylor really begin to start coming into his own, right? Because he is going to stand out and become more pronounced over the next little while. But dude, good stuff. Can't wait for next time.
Sure.
Awesome. All right. Bye, everybody.
Listening to the Mormon Renegade Podcast.